Okay, good morning, everyone who's just coming in. We'll give this a few minutes for people to get into the room, but welcome to our Trade Policy Research Forum webinar with Professor Maggie Chen from GWU and Lucian Cernat from the European Commission. And it's great to see you guys here and great to have my colleague Hannah here as well.
Hey, everybody. Hey, Ben. So good to be here. Finally, November 17th. We've been wanting to do this seminar for a long time. And I guess once you put the video out there, it was just like, time was standing still. I'm like, kid, this seminar, just come already. I've been looking so much forward to it. So people are just falling in here. So good to see you. Some really, some people we know well here, some people who are new to me, at least. Me, as always, here. Oh, and Lucian's colleague Loss is here. Hey, cool thing people can do is to jump on in the chat box and just write, hey, and where you're from, because that makes us A, get to know you a little better, and B, that means that you've tried out the chat box before you start asking questions there. So that's a really good place to start warming up. So good to see everybody. Come on in. It's gonna be a fantastic day today. We're so excited to have Maggie here today and to have Lucian back. As we say in Sweden, people who really, happy customers come back. But in this case, we're the customer, and we're just happy to have Lucian back. So why don't you guys try out the chat box? Are people writing in the chat box? Hello, welcome. Where are we coming in from today? Colombo, Sri Lanka, hey, New Zealand. Oh, Mia, hey. Oh, mountains of Switzerland. Cool. Welcome. Keep those hellos coming. That's a really good place to start. Welcome. So my name is Hannah Norberg, and I'm here with Ben Shepherd today at the TPR Forum. Welcome back if you've been here before. Special welcome if, more from Switzerland, if this is your first try here. So in case you haven't been here before, it might be a good place to start over at the website, tprforum.org. That's where we put all the recordings and presentations, and we will do so also after today in case you want an encore or catch up on something that we've done before. So just to give you a short overview of what we do here at the TPR Forum, as you can see, we have a little bridge there. That's not just because Ben is from Sydney, but also because that's our aim to bridge the gap between trade policy and research, and between research of different areas and across the world and across generations. And so cool, welcome. And so that's what we do. So once a month we run a webinar like this. And if we're lucky enough, like today, we get an awesome researcher, and then we get a really great policymaker to comment on it. And the idea is to sort of mimic what you would get in a brown bag seminar somewhere. What am I missing, Ben? Hey, Spain, Josephine from Spain, come on in. Good to see you. What am I missing, Ben?
I think that's the forum. So you guys know the website. There's a mailing list there that you can sign up for to stay up to date on webinars. And perhaps, this is a good opportunity to introduce our speakers. So our main speaker today is Professor Maggie Chen. She's a professor of economics and international affairs at George Washington University in Washington, DC. So Maggie, it's great to have you here. You and I go way back. We were trying to figure out to exactly when. I'm not going to embarrass either of us by mentioning a year, but it's really nice to have you here. And I think it's a fascinating piece of research that you're going to be presenting on can evidence-based information shift preferences towards trade policy. So I think for a lot of us who are in the space between research and policy and research and practice, it's a really key question. So we're very much looking forward to what you have to say. And as Hannah said, part of what we want to do is bridge the gap between research and policy and research and practice. And so we have a great discussant today who's coming back. He's been with us before, Lucian Cernat from the European Commission. He's the head of global regulatory cooperation and international procurement regulations at the EC. And of course, in a former life, he was chief economist at DG Trade. So someone who is very experienced in working with people on trade policy and perhaps even trying to change their minds on some occasions. So I think it'll be a really nice conversation between our two speakers. And with that, I'll hand over to you, Maggie, for your presentation. Thanks.
Well, can I just say before we start, questions and comments as we go, right? So don't be shy, put them in the Q&A, put them in the comments box so that we can have a conversation. Sorry, Maggie, I didn't mean to interrupt. I just wanted to make sure that people can engage with you.
Of course, of course. Okay, everybody can see the screen okay?
Yes.
Good. Oh, thank you so much. Thank you, Ben. Thank you, Hannah, for the kind invitation. I'm so excited to be here to get to know the platform and to share my work on the platform. This is a terrific audience. And I have a sense it's going to be a fun conversation. And I'm very excited and looking forward to hearing your comments and thoughts from Lucian and from everybody else in the audience. So the project is joint work with Laura Alfaro from HBS and David Chur from Dartmouth. In the recent decades, especially after the global financial crisis, we have seen growing economic grievances, including the declining manufacturing employment in developed countries, weak wage growth, and rising income inequality. And all of these have fueled this increasing backlash against globalization. And the trend further escalated after the outbreak of the pandemic, with all the disruptions in supply chains, shortages, and export restrictions in PPE and vaccines. At the same time, many political actors have tapped into these economic grievances in their political campaigns, blaming a lot of domestic problems on globalization. And these political campaigns have operated by disseminating narratives, calling for protectionist policies, rather than communicating evidence-based information on the positive and negative effects of trade. And these campaigns and narratives have been facilitated by the rise of digital platforms, which substantially lower the costs of producing and disseminating fast information and the political messages that are not always supported by economic evidence. So in this current political and information environment, understanding how information backed by research might actually affect policy preferences becomes critical and urgent. So in this paper, our question is the following: can evidence-based information communicated in a concise and accessible manner actually shift individuals' preferences for trade policy? So to answer this question, our approach is to conduct survey experiments that provide randomized information treatments on the gains and the losses from trade. This approach has a key advantage, and that is allowing us to isolate the effect of exposure to information from the possibility of selecting information based on one's interests and beliefs. So to undertake this experiment, we stratify samples of US general population, and we assign these individuals randomly to several groups. That would include a pure control group to which we do not provide any information treatment. And we would also have several treatment groups to which we provide evidence-based information treatments. Those treatments would include a narrative on how trade has hurt manufacturing jobs based on recent economic research, and a treatment that would actually have this opposite narrative, highlighting how trade can help certain jobs at the same time. And we also have several other treatments showing the benefits of trade on prices and the cost of tariffs on prices. After the treatments, we follow up by soliciting respondents' views on their preferred economic policies. These samples are representative of the US general population. We have reached out to about 20,000 respondents over the years through Qualtrics. And our experiments span from 2018 to 2022 with an unprecedented series of disruptions in these years, including a pandemic, supply chain disruptions, Black Lives Matter movement, election, and inflation. So more specifically on our treatments, we have these 4 baseline treatments to which we provide 4 types of evidence-based information. The first one would be the narrative on how trade, in particular import competition from China, had weakened manufacturing employment in the United States. And that is going to be based on the work of Otto Adorn Hansen 2013. And then in our second baseline treatment, we would provide a different type of narrative showing how trade liberalization has enabled the US economy to specialize in their comparative advantage sector and created service jobs. Based on, again, the paper by Calindo and co-authors in 2019. For our price treatments, we show how imports from China have lowered the goods prices in the United States, or how the tariffs, the recent tariffs, have actually raised prices and hurt US consumers. So what did we find? A quick preview. We find that evidence-based information can influence trade policy preferences, but in complex and even unanticipated ways. So for the trade hurts job narrative, we find, as we anticipated, that had raised the likelihood of the respondents selecting more limits on imports as their preferred policy. However, strikingly, we find the narratives, the treatments showing the benefits of trade, including how trade has helped prices, how tariffs have hurt prices, also raise the protectionist preferences. And in fact, all of these treatment effects we have documented in 2018 and 2019 were found to hold similarly in 2020 to 2022. So what could possibly drive this surprising finding? Well, I'm sure we can all come up with a host of possible explanations. So we try to explore them, including, for example, the role of attention and comprehension. And we found that this result was not driven by the lack of comprehension, though there is some evidence suggesting that increased attention could dampen the protectionist reactions to the trade health narratives. We also show that this result is actually important, has important implications in the age of fast information consumption, right? If we are able to ensure extended attention to our narratives, perhaps it would make our counter narrative more effective in convincing people or shaping people's preferences. We also show that the result was not driven by economic self-interest. Economists have long assumed that individuals' trade policy preferences should align with their exposure to trade, right? Their exposure to the positive and negative effects of trade. But we find that is not to be the main cause of the surprising result. Finally, we find instead is the interaction between information and our respondents' priors that can drive some of the results we document. We find the information treatments have operated by reinforcing and provoking the anti-globalization beliefs already held by our respondents, the loss-averse behavior, and their priorities on jobs, and finally, their concerns about China. So let me just jump into the survey design to show you a little bit more how the survey was implemented. So the survey itself was mounted on Qualtrics, which is a survey platform, and it's fairly user-friendly, relatively short to be complete in between 5 to 10 minutes. Our survey itself consists of several parts, 4 parts in particular. The first part was designed to collect information on the respondents' biographic information characteristics such as gender, age, race, where they were born, where they reside, education level, employment, occupation, so on. And then we also solicit their background belief with questions such as where the individual would place themselves on the liberal and conservative spectrum on economic policy, whom they supported in the last elections, how they view inequality as a problem, and whether they trust governments, whether they were satisfied with job market, whether they view NAFTA as positive or negative on their lives, and so on. We also asked them what kind of news sources they consume on a daily basis and their main sources of information. In the second part, we provide information. So here is when we actually randomly assign individuals to different groups, right? There will be a group 0, the control group, that receives no information whatsoever. And there's a treatment group 1, which will be fed information about how trade has hurt jobs. Information 2 would be told trade can actually help jobs. Information group 3 would be told that trade can help prices. And then finally, the group that's told tariff has hurt prices. So just to give you a sense of what the information looks like. So all of these information treatments will start with a very simple preamble. And then we would show how the recent economic research has shown that the US, for example, in this case, increased imports from China after China joined WTO. And this was found to be a major force behind the decline in the US manufacturing sector, as shown in this figure taken from the research cited. So you can see in this figure that the solid curve is the US imports from China from 1987 to around 2007, and the red downward sloping curve is the decline in the US manufacturing employment. For this other treatment, the second treatment on jobs, we would produce a similar language, right, and a similar graph, except this time we show that the imports from China are correlated with the increase in the total employment, especially in the service sector. And you can see through our treatments, we have tried very hard to keep the language accessible and similar, comparable across treatments. And we also have tried to make the figure very similar across treatment groups. So in this figure, we are looking at the price benefits of trade. And language is similar, except this time we highlight how imports, especially imports from China, have helped, at least in terms of correlation, kept the prices in the United States low. And then finally, we are zooming into the recent tariffs on China in the last couple of years and show how the tariffs based on recent research has led to higher prices in the tariff affected goods. So these are our 4 baseline treatments. And we have also gone back to the field over and over again by mixing them up and just having, all kinds of variations. We try to mix the treatments. We have tried to take out the mention of China because we want to see if that's going to change any results. We have tried to change the ordering of the treatments when we provide the balanced information. So it's worth noting that all of our treatments are based on the economic research, and we're not providing any hypothetical scenarios. We're not providing any misinformation. And in the third part, this is when we solicit their individuals' views about preferences, including whether they support placing more limits on imports, whether they support raising tariff rates, who they want to raise tariffs on, which industries, whether they support higher minimum wage. And then finally, we ask them to choose from 8 policy instruments and rank them, right? And choose the most preferred policy instruments and least preferred policy instruments among the 8 given here, including higher taxes on top income earners, higher minimum wage, right? Improving education, and more limits, or even leaving existing free trade agreements. In the last part of our survey, we asked the respondents to validate and explain the choices, right? We asked them if they think the information they saw earlier has affected their views. And we also even test them to see if they actually remember when they saw earlier. And then finally, if they choose more limits on imports, we ask them specifically the reasons why they choose the limits on imports. And then we even ask them to write out the answers instead of picking one from the choices we have provided. Now, we have, as I mentioned earlier, we have gone back to the field starting in 2018 and then gone back to the field over and over the years. Okay. In the end, we have reached about 20,000 respondents and with the different treatment groups we have designed. Now, just jumping into the summary statistics a little bit and show what kind of preferences are expressed, right, across the board, across all of our groups. We find that when we ask the question, the binary question, do you support an increase in the limits on imports? We get about over half, sometimes 60% of people to say yes. So when the choice is presented in a binary fashion, more than half of the people will say yes to more limits on imports. Interestingly, when we ask them to select 3 most preferred policies out of the 8 choices given, limits on imports were not most of the time chosen as one of the 3 most preferred choices. It seems like the preferences for trade protection are not as strong compared to the preferences for alternative policy instruments, such as, for example, higher minimum wage, which 60% of the time would be chosen as one of the most preferred policy instruments. And it was trade protection was also not ranked as high as, for example, more progressive taxes, which means higher taxes on the top income earners. Now, what about the treatment effects? Do our treatment groups behave differently and express different trade policy preferences than our control groups? So to establish our causal information treatment effects, we run the following regression. So our dependent variable, right, could be a dummy variable for whether the respondents supported increase over the limits on imports. Or it could be whether the respondents have chosen trade protection as one of the most preferred policies. And then on the right-hand side, we would look at whether the individual was a control group or one of the treatment groups receiving our narratives. Okay, and our key parameter here is beta, which captures the treatment effect of our information. And of course, we control for all of these characteristics we have collected, right? About the respondent education, employment status, industry, occupation, their beliefs, right? Their exposure to trade, and so on. So among our controls, as I mentioned earlier, we control for their biographic information, but also we control for their political position, their news consumption, the exposure to trade, right, by looking at where they reside and how much exposure the counties have been to import competition, for example, the education levels, right, and their priors about the impact of trade, and the priors about, for example, inequality and so on. Okay. All right, let's get into our findings. So first, we look at the baseline result, based on the sample we collected from 2018 to 2019. Here we have 3 simple treatment groups: trade hurts jobs, trade helps jobs, and trade helps prices. And the dependent variables would be, whether you support more limits on imports, whether you support increasing tariffs, whether you support higher tariffs on specific countries and industries, whether you support more FTAs, whether you choose more limits on imports as one of the most preferred policies. And then the last column is a composite variable that combines all of these first 5 columns here. Okay, so what did we find? We find that the group that was told trade, in particular imports from China, had led to declines in manufacturing employment, across the board supported more protection, more limits on imports. So this is perhaps not surprising, right? When I was exposed to information about the negative effects and job losses from trade, I expressed protectionist preferences. What is interesting is that when I'm told trade can help jobs, in particular service jobs, I don't see a symmetric response, right? The respondents actually do not behave any differently than the control group. Now, what about the price streams? Here, if you look at the trade helps price group, right? This is the group that's told that imports, in particular imports from China, have contributed to low prices of durable and non-durable goods, right? If the responses would be symmetric to the trade hurts job narrative, we would see this group to actually express less protectionist preferences, right? So the treatment effects would be negative. However, our estimated treatment effects are actually very similar to the treatment effects of trade hurts jobs. This group also raised the propensity to select more limits on imports. This is quite different from our initial expectations. Now, this motivated us to go back to the field, right? In 2020 and 2022, right? As we got into the pandemic, we also want to see how the results would differ. And we also rolled out experiments that removed the mention of China to see if the results were, any different. So what did we find? First of all, we found the two baseline treatments on jobs remain broadly similar. We did not find significant differences in how individuals responded to these narratives. We also found that removing the mention of China from the trade hurts job narrative, and this is when we just simply took out the word China from the evidence-based information, and we found that actually did not really fundamentally change the treatment or the reactions. Similarly, when we rolled out the price narrative treatments again, and we found the surprising result to stay across the board. And this is true when we also mentioned how tariff has hurt prices, right? So this is when the tariffs have been in place, the US-China tariffs have been in place for a couple of years now, and we tell the individuals that, well, these have actually led to higher prices on the tariff-affected industries. And we did not find that to move people to choose less protection. If anything, they actually continue to prefer more protection over the industries. All right, now how big is the impact, right? What's the magnitude of our treatment effect? So we look at, for example, the trade hurts job narrative, and we found the marginal effect of receiving that information to be actually around 1/3 of the marginal effect of the individual self-identifying as someone who supported the Republican presidential candidate. So this seems quite economically important in terms of magnitude. And we also try to provide a balanced set of information by telling a group that trade can hurt jobs and trade can also help jobs, right? To see if that balanced information would make any difference. And we find that when we tell people trade can help jobs, after we tell them trade hurts manufacturing jobs, there is some offsetting effect, okay? When the trade help jobs actually appears last. So it seems like whatever you tell people last does make people resonate a little bit more, okay? And other covariates on the right-hand side, the characteristics of the individuals, some of them also matter in the way they express their policy preferences. For example, who they supported in presidential election were found to have an independent relationship with their preferences for trade policy. Older age groups tend to prefer more trade protection, right? The news consumption sources also seem to have a relationship with the preferences for trade policy. And the randomization order was also controlful. Okay. Now, obviously, the next question is why? What can explain these treatment effects, right? There is a host of possible explanations and possible causes. The first one that comes to mind is it attention? Maybe people just didn't pay attention to all information treatment, right? So we explore that kind of explanation by looking at whether individuals could actually recall the information they received, right? If they just flip through the pages of the survey, they probably didn't even notice what they were told. But we found that on average, respondents were able to recall correctly the information treatment. So that means it's probably not the driving force. We also find, interestingly, right, if people pay more attention, right? Spend more time on that page, right? Because our survey was page by page. If people were found to spend more time on the page with the evidence-based information, right? This would be the group, right? If you look at interaction term here, that spend above median attention duration of time on the treatment page. Those people would either become even more protectionist after seeing how trade has hurt jobs, or become less protectionist after they've seen the benefits of trade. So this suggests that the reactions would be more aligned with the information for people who spend more time on the information. So that gives us some hope, right, in the effect of the information treatments. And then there are many other possible mechanisms, right? For example, maybe, right, I respond to the information because of my economic self-interest, right? Maybe because of my personal exposure to trade, how much I've been affected negatively by imports competition, especially imports from China. Or maybe because of my education level, or maybe because my social concerns about income inequality or my trust over the government, or maybe because of my political identity and existing priors, or how averse I am to losses. Maybe I just care about job losses more than the price benefits, right? So these are not super easy to read graphs, so don't worry if you don't really get it right away. So let me just quickly explain. So these dots here, right, represent the difference in the treatment effects between groups that were employed, for example, in manufacturing versus the group that was not employed in manufacturing. Okay, so if the dots were very close to zero, that suggests that where I'm employed really does not affect my treatment effect. It does not really affect how I respond to information. Okay, and then we have the 4 dots on the left-hand side, and then the four points on the right-hand side. The right-hand side represents the group that spends more time on the survey. So we want to see if that makes any difference. So overall, if you look at, for example, the figure 1 and figure 2, and in fact, even figure 3, 4, and 5, right? Maybe with some action in 5, you don't really see these points being different from the 0 line, suggesting that, right, whether I'm exposed to China shock, whether I have less than college education, whether I'm unemployed, right, really do not affect how I respond to information. Okay, the only place we see some action is actually figure 6 here, whether I see NAFTA having had a negative impact on the family, right? And for the individuals who spend more than median time on the treatment, they tend to behave more protectionistly after seeing the price benefits of trade. So even if I see that trade can help keep prices low, but because I view NAFTA having had a negative impact on my family, I would still react with more preferences for trade protection. So that's how I would interpret this figure. Similarly, we also look at the interaction between our price treatments and social concerns, right? In most figures, you don't see any differences between groups, right? Whether I see US income inequality as a problem, right, don't really make me behave differently than those who don't see US inequality as a problem, right? The place we see some reaction is, for example, figure 8 here, right? Whether people view US inflation as a problem, and whether I disagree that my children will have a better life, and whether I have trust in the government, right? So it seems like, for example, if I don't think my children will have better life, right, I will likely prefer more trade protection, despite seeing how trade has had a positive effect on prices. So it seems like the key places where we see information interacts with individuals' characteristics is how they perceive trade and how they perceive the impact of trade, right? Whether they are happy with the impact of trade on job market, how confident how they are about the future of their children. Similarly, if we interact information treatment with their political identity and the loss aversion, right? We see a lot more traction here, okay? We find people who are more loss averse, right? We had a kind of interesting question to measure the loss aversion. And then we find those groups who are more averse to losses tend to want more protectionist policies, despite being told the benefits of trade. Similarly, those who supported Republican candidates in the last elections would want more trade protection, in contrast to those who supported Democratic candidates in the last elections. Okay. Now, the last question is, well, is there anything else going on, right? Aside from my my political beliefs, my loss aversion, right, my social concerns. So here we ask people who have chosen limits on imports to tell us, right, which one of these reasons, right, motivated that choice. And we find that the top two reasons were imports often compete for US jobs, and they were concerned about imports from China. Okay, so these reasons received higher scores compared to, for example, not being persuaded, right? That's not ranked as the #1 top reasons for choosing more limits on imports. Or, for example, imports often lower quality. Okay, so it suggests that the priority on jobs and concerns about imports from China were some of the two key reasons that motivated the choices and the reactions to the information. We also asked the respondents to tell us who they want to place the limits on, right? And this is a word cloud analysis of the answers given by the respondents. The left-hand side figure is based on the responses from the groups who were told the job effects and the price effects of trade with the mention of China. The right-hand side figure comes from the groups who were not seeing information with the word China. But you can see the responses are remarkably similar, right? So China, along with other countries like Russia, right? Even, let's see, North Korea, right? Were listed, Mexico, as some of the key countries where they would like to see more limits on imports. Finally, in our open-end question, we asked them to tell us why, right? Tell us in words why you want to have more limits on imports. Again, we have two figures based on whether the individual has seen the word mention of China. And then you see very similar keywords, right? Jobs, right, has the largest font, meaning was mentioned most frequently. And then you see keywords like self-reliance, right? Keywords like made in USA, and keywords like China again. So it seems like overwhelmingly, right, it does not matter what kind of information, right, based on evidence has been conveyed to the respondents. They have similar preferences for trade policy. And these preferences are not really driven by economic self-interest, but rather the concerns listed here. So just to conclude, we have found that both trade hurts narrative and trade helps and tariff hurts narratives to have a similar effects, right? By provoking individuals' preferences for trade protection. The randomization allows us to have a causal interpretation, and we find the findings to be broadly robust across the years. And we find the mechanism underlying the result was not due to lack of persuasion or economic interest, but rather how the existing priors and priorities and concerns were provoked, were motivated by the information received. So what are the broader implications? What does our result have to say about public communication and the education with regards to the benefits and the cost of globalization, right? So this is ultimately our question. And I think our research reaffirms the difficulty, which is probably going to be some of the experiences the audience probably had, communicating research that challenges one's existing priors, especially in a fast information format. Individuals' trade policy preferences were found not to be a symmetric function of the expected gains and losses from trade, Instead, we see more weights on certain factors such as jobs and more weights on the greater power competition between the US and China. And this suggests that public messaging that focuses exclusively on communicating the benefits of trade are unlikely to succeed unless these narratives also allow people to address the broader geopolitical concerns. So I'll stop here and happy to hear any comments and questions.
Thanks so much, Maggie. That's a really great presentation and a fascinating paper, both from a methodological standpoint and also in terms of the results. There are lots of challenges there and lots to think about. And so I'll hand over to Lucian Cernat for his comments. Thanks.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you, Hannah, for the invitation. Hello, everyone. It's really good to see so many familiar names and friends in the participants list. So I think one of the reasons why we have such an impressive audience with lots of experts, practitioners, and academics is precisely because Maggie touched upon a crucial, really an important, a fundamental aspect of what we do. Does evidence change people's minds about trade? Huge question, right? If so, what evidence and in what direction, pro or against trade? I mean, these are questions for which I think people are ready to pay a lot of money to get the answers right. I mean, imagine many of us, I saw colleagues from both UN or academia or the European Commission. I personally have been struggling with these issues for more than 2 decades. First, as a UN official dealing with trade. For instance, trade in the UN context can be a very divisive topic sometimes. Does trade liberalization force the development? You can have a lot of debates about it. So you need the evidence to make people converge to some common understanding. Then, as chief trade economist at the European Commission for more than a decade or so, I've seen trade being a very divisive topic in Europe as well. I'll focus now just to give you perhaps the practitioner's view to things. I'll focus on one example, and if I have time, maybe a second one briefly. But the main example I wanted to focus on where trade views are very strong and sometimes facts do not matter as much as they should in the European context was during the negotiations of the EU-US agreement, TTIP, as it was called, and also connected to it, the EU-Canada FTA, known by the acronym CETA. So you imagine if you were in such a massively divisive trade-related political crisis with thousands of people in the streets of Berlin or Brussels or Paris demonstrating against a trade agreement, you would really like to have the instruction manual. How do I deal with these things? So Maggie, if you had that research at the time, it would be like, I guess, the invention of electricity. You know, someone would come in and switch on the light. So we will all say, oh, that's how we need to communicate on trade. Now I got it. But actually, if you listen carefully to what Maggie said, I think for us practitioners, there are not that many good news. I mean, it makes our jobs, it seems like our jobs are even more difficult than we thought, right? So what I wanted to throw in as an additional, perhaps, element that can illustrate and explain some of the puzzling effects that Maggie obtained is also the level of analysis. And I know you touched upon a bit, but my personal experience, and I will give you the example that illustrates it, is that information matters to individuals when it's calibrated to their own prior beliefs and their immediate interests. So typically, you know, we all communicate on macro effects. You know, trade policy leads to 0.x% in GDP. This FTA will increase exports to Canada by 15.3%. These are factually robust, very strong, very impressive macro numbers, but individuals don't know how to relate with billions. They don't know how to relate with 0.3% of GDP. So objectively speaking, even if you were prepared to go along with that argument, it's hard for you to relate personally with those. So then if that's the case, what kind of evidence do we need to shed more light, the kind of clinical light, the kind of, you basically run a clinical trial, the kind of trial we have for new drugs, I mean, just to make sure that they work in practice. So what does it seem to work? I mean, according to you, I think you touched upon a number of things that we also, without having your robust evidence behind, we kind of blindly tried a few things for this CETA example. So we went into what I like to call trade policy 2.0, meaning very, very detailed, very firm level related kind of information, and also geolocalization of information to where you actually live. So we had this idea to move away from macro indicators and to say, look, if we have an important political process ahead of us, if we have to convince politicians and also citizens to give us the legitimacy that we want for trade policy. I mean, in any democratic society, we want our policies to be legitimate and people to go along and be convinced that we do the right thing. We need something that cuts ice, I mean, something that will allow people to see the benefits of a free trade agreement. We were convinced that has positive effects. So we made this CETA comes to town campaign. Essentially, we took firm level data. We managed to obtain from a private company that specializes in that kind of market intelligence, because this data does not exist in Europe. You don't have firm level trade data at your fingertips in official statistics. So we had to buy this data from a reliable source, and basically we obtained a number of parameters that allowed us to geolocalize, to really put on the map the picture that CETA would have in terms of export potential across Europe. So if CETA comes to town, look more or less like this. I think it's the other slide I wanted to show you. I don't know if you see the map of Europe with a lot of dots. So essentially, we decided to move away from GDP and from macro indicators and to say to MEPs, but also to individual citizens, because this is a snapshot of a public website. I didn't put here the link, but if you Google it, you will see it. You zoom in and you go, and if you're interested in what's behind number 57 in Hungary, or the 1,000 companies in next to Lyon area in France, or the ones around Paris, you can really zoom in at street level and say, aha, here are the companies that export products X, Y, and Z to Canada. And if we were to remove tariffs and other barriers, these companies would stand to benefit. So we created these fact sheets that would speak to people, in particular to MEPs. We had a very traumatic experience in the Wallonian Regional Parliament. Some of you remember that in 2016, the Wallonian Regional Parliament voted against CETA. We had all our traffic lights in Brussels. The red light was covered with stickers saying stop CETA. So when you are at the traffic light and it's the red light, you don't see the red light, you see a red light with stop CETA on it. It was really a very fierce debate among politicians and in society about a particular trade agreement. So we realized it's important for us to reach out to people. So we had fact sheets, very specific fact sheets that we presented to some of these MEPs, and would say, well, honorable MEP, I know you're from the Lyon area, let's say, and I think you are against this agreement, but did you know that in your area there are around 1,000 companies exporting to Canada? Did you know that these companies face tariffs, maybe double-digit tariffs, that they cannot sell cheese and wine or whatever? And if they were to expand their exports as a result of this removal of barriers in Canada, they may create jobs in your area. And by the way, out of the 1,000 companies, around 80% are small and medium enterprises. And we would even have maybe a few other examples of the exact products that are produced by these companies. And then we say, well, you know, if you go back, as you do every Thursday or Friday, to your constituency, they might ask you, why did you vote against CETA? I hope you have a good answer for that, or maybe you want to change your mind. Maybe now you want to think twice. Maybe this is actually good for that region. So it didn't work with everyone. We still had 200 MEPs against the agreement, but we had 400 in favor. So I'm not sure exactly I could tell you how many changed their mind because of this kind of information, but we received feedback, clear feedback in writing that some of them did change their minds as a result of such detailed information. So that's how I think we realize that sometimes if you have the right indicators, you could make some people change their minds. But you know, changing people's minds is not that easy. In fact, it's part, as you rightly mentioned in your very thorough analysis, these ideas about trade policy do not happen in a vacuum. You know, they are connected in complicated ways to our personal beliefs, to the way we look at the world. So even if you were to be able to change someone's mind, this is a very slow process. You need to have to give them time to reflect upon it. So that's why perhaps, and I'm glad that you had this particular parameter. Maybe they didn't spend enough time on it, you said at some point. I think it is very important to make sure that the message sinks in. So that's why, for instance, the FTA comes to town is a feature of all our negotiations. We are now systematically doing this on all our new FTAs because we understood that it's important, and maybe by doing it more frequently, then the message will come across more quickly and in a more solid, robust manner. The other example I wanted to mention very quickly, and then I will conclude my remarks. You know, it goes without saying that I was extremely impressed by the wealth of information. I wish we had the same kind of information as you had, Maggie, for your study. We have something else. It's called Eurobarometer. We have a survey, pan-European survey, and I'm curious to perhaps make to cross-check the fundamentals of our Eurobarometers, the logic behind that survey, and some of the lessons we learned from your very interesting paper. But the other example I thought might be relevant in terms of people changing their minds in a European context, we have a very little known instrument and policy adjustment mechanism called the European Globalization Fund. So the European Globalization Fund is like the TAA, the trade adjustment in the US. So essentially, whenever people lose their jobs, which can be somehow loosely connected to globalization, to increasing imports, to delocalization, to the kind of things that we like to blame trade policy for. Whenever that happens, there is this instrument that allows for policy intervention to bring people back to the job market. And we have ex post analysis evidence that to a large extent, this instrument is very effective. People get a new job. Sometimes they even become self-employed, successful mini entrepreneurs. And there is a little survey as part of this evaluation. You ask someone, so think about it. There's a guy who loses his job in a well-paid job in a manufacturing factory. Then it goes through a very rough period, presumably some unemployment. And eventually, thanks to policy intervention, he gets another job. And you ask that person how she or he feels about it. And we have this evidence that for a large proportion of these people who would normally be against trade, look, they lost their jobs because of trade. So when they get a new job as a result of policy intervention, they actually are quite positive about the whole experience. They say that they like their new job, sometimes even more than the old job, and they don't necessarily have a huge loss in income. So maybe it's a feature of the European job market, or maybe it's a self-selection, I don't know. But there are these examples where you could say, well, you can make people somewhat positive about trade, even if they suffered individually maybe a temporary setback from it. So I will stop here, Ben. I think I tried to give you a very concrete policy example on how to try to change people's mind and eventually, sometimes, occasionally succeed.
That's great. Thanks, Lucian. I think those comments are really useful. So like we said at the outset, something that we try to do here is get researchers and policy folks and practitioners talking to each other. And so I think that this is a great example of what we're trying to do. Maggie, I'll hand back to you in just a second to respond to those comments. But before I do, let me just add in a question that I think is related to some of the issues that Lucian raised, and it's from Susan Aronson, who put it in the comments. And basically that is, to what extent does the process surrounding trade policy influence this outcome that you found? So are we, in some sense, tracking the fact that people feel excluded from the trade policy process and therefore form these very strong priors, which even when you hit them with research information, they don't necessarily, I think as Lucian said, that they're not going to change their mind based on just one piece of information. So is there something about the process as well of trade policy that we might need to think about a little bit differently in terms of who gets to participate in it and the sort of mechanisms that we use for that? So that was a comment that came out of the Q&A, but please feel free to respond to that and also to Lucian's comments.
Thanks so much. Thanks, Lucian and Ben and Susan as well in the audience and others for the questions and comments. Lucian, I really think I could not have hoped for a better discussion for this paper. You just, give us ideas about what to do when we go back to the field. This is, this is why this is really a terrific platform for our research presentation. So yes, I agree that our approach has been showing or treating people with economic research evidence. But what our results are suggesting is there is a gap between the typical evidence or findings we show in our research and how people respond to those information. And one of the explanations could be that they just don't relate to the economic evidence that is presented in our research. So, and I agree, one of the alternative ways to shape people's preferences is to present them something else. And that could be maybe less research-backed evidence, but more, hands-on information, visually presented to them about their personal exposure to the opportunities brought by trade, in this case, CETA, right? And that might move people more. So I think this is definitely a very valid suggestion. I would say that the literature, there have been some papers done in this topic area, and where the typical approach has been talking about the hypothetical scenarios, right? What if a factory was shut down? And this is one reason. That's another reason how people would respond to that hypothetical case. But this is different from what you are suggesting, which is using real life data, perhaps personally related real life data, and to see how people respond to that information. And I think we can definitely think about doing that in our next round if we go back to the field. And then you mentioned, I would definitely check out the survey. I don't know whether it's now available online, the European Globalization Fund survey, how people, perceptions might change or might become positive after they have seen the effectiveness of policy intervention, in this case, the trade adjustment kind of assistance intervention in the European context. We do ask them questions like, have you lost jobs? Have you, we didn't ask them why they lost their jobs, because we did not want to, provoke their sentiment too early before seeing the treatment. So that's why we stayed out of that in the first part of the survey. But this is excellent suggestions. The idea is to move away from the macro indicators to more personally relatable information. And about, so Susan had a great comment about trust, right? So we do have a variety of questions on trust. We ask people if they trust the government. We don't ask, directly how well you feel you are involved in the trade policy making process. We didn't ask them that way. But I think some of the questions can shed light on that channel, and that is we ask them if they trust the government. If they trust corporations, if they trust foreigners, if they trust their neighbors, and so on. So we ask a lot of trust questions. We don't see a lot of traction there, but there is one place that is trust in government. We have some results suggesting that those who have more trust in government would actually prefer less trade protectionist policies. So of course, you can interpret it in a number of ways, but I think one of which could be that if I have more trust in the government, maybe I have more confidence in the government's ability to address these, adjustment costs, these reallocation issues, in other ways through these policy interventions that Lucian mentioned, right? Maybe I will get help in getting a new job. I have more confidence on that. Then I don't rely on tariffs to protect me. So that could be one interpretation. And I think that's probably speaking to Susan's question.
That's great, Maggie. Thanks so much for coming back on those points. I think there's a much longer discussion we could have. Let me just round off with something else that's come up in the Q&A, and I'm not asking you to respond to it. I just think it's an interesting way of looking at a couple of the different interventions that you've got. This is from Yvonne, and he's mentioned that the way people perceive something like a price change may depend on how they're thinking about themselves. So if I think of myself as a worker, a decrease in prices is a bad thing because I'm going to associate that with a tougher competitive condition for the business that I work in, potentially job loss and all the rest. Of course, if I think of myself as a consumer, then prices going down is a good thing. And I think the intervention has people thinking of themselves as a consumer, but what if there are these different identities that people are wearing? And I just wonder if there's any sort of way of teasing that out.
Absolutely. That's a great insight. And that's precisely what we see. In one of the papers, I show that for those groups who were told the trade helps prices low, keep prices low, people also express concerns about jobs,
Yeah.
And I think that's probably exactly why what Yvonne suggested, it just cannot isolate jobs from, prices.
Absolutely. I mean, I think what I take away from the research, I take away two things from today's discussion. One is that convincing people on trade policy probably requires more than telling them about research findings. And this is a good lesson for me because I spent a lot of my life doing the sort of stuff that you've just described, Maggie, which is sort of trying to popularize research, get it out there, and do these kind of evidence-based changes. And I've really got to think about what else I need to do to try and convince people. And I think Lucian's comments were really interesting because there's obviously this way in which bringing it close to home, so making it less abstract and something very personal, obviously matters to people. I think it's there in your results as well when you control for people's exposure to trade at the county level. So making it personal. It's not something that we're always trained to do as economists in particular. I think there are other disciplines out there that have a lot more training on that. But perhaps that's a discussion that we have going forward, how we work with people who've got that sort of background to go forward on trade policy. But look, I'm conscious that we're out of time. It's been a really informative session. I've got to say, I really got a lot out of this. So thank you, Maggie, for the great presentation and really excellent paper. And thanks also, Lucian, for joining us again and providing some really fantastic comments, both much appreciated. Before we leave, let me quickly do a little bit of publicity for our next session. So our next session is on December 8th. It's going to be a change of pace. We're going to be talking about responsible sourcing. So looking in particular at an example from Costa Rica, and we'll be joined by Isabella Manalici from London School of Economics. So if you're interested in responsible sourcing, if you're interested in GVCs, these kinds of issues, then please do come along and join us on December 8th, as usual, at 9 a.m. Eastern Time. So with that, let me thank Maggie, thank Lucian, and thank Hannah for a fantastic session. And thanks, of course, to all of the participants for being here, for giving us your attention, and also for the great questions and comments that were going into chat. So thanks, everyone, and we look forward to seeing you in December. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
And just let everyone know that the recording and the presentations will be coming up on the website because someone was asking, and I've been getting emails about it too. And we're out of time, but Maggie, I just wanted to ask you how you got 20,000 people to answer your survey. Anyone who's been trying to run a survey, to see this, it's not just the holy grail of the question, but also getting this huge undertaking. So impressive. I'm going to reach out and find out how you did that bilaterally, because that blew me away too.
Thankfully, I didn't have to make 20,000 phone calls. Thanks so much. Thank you. Thank you, Lucian,
Okay.
for the comment.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Bye.